Hi there. This episode is the first of a series on building the Mi-2 helicopter, or as locals call it, the flying chicken thigh. As a child I used to see these all the time both in police and medical service colors, but somehow they never really piqued my interest. Well, that was quite a while ago, and now I made a sudden decision to give this kit a go in my first ever video. If only I had known what I was up against. So, here's what we're dealing with. 4 grey sprues and the clear one with the transparent parts. The usual black and white instructions. A color sheet for the Polish Air Force version. A matching decal sheet. And lastly, a flyer from the distant 2011. The main sprue contains the fuselage halves and parts of the interior. Like most modern kits, this one also comes with recessed panel lines and hints of rivet detail. And while I do appreciate the effort that went into this, my preference is to either have full surface detail or nothing at all. A blank canvas is always better to work on than having to blend manually edit details with the ones that came with the kit. On the other grey sprues we have the air intakes, rotors, exhaust, external fuel tanks, machine guns and various small details, most of which look either way too thick or oversimplified. This can easily ruin the illusion of scale and proportion and will definitely need to go. As I'm recording this, I'm still in complete denial about the molded on windscreen wiper. It looks ridiculous, but any attempt to remove it can result in irreversibly damaging the entire part. As a friend likes to say, I'll burn that bridge when I get there. On the decal front, we get the Polish insignia, the tail numbers, a few stencils and some gizmos for the dashboard and the overhead panel. Most of which I'm not going to use, as I decided to do something a little bit different. As I was skimming through some online references, I came across some high quality photos, mostly from before my time. Not only are the pictures themselves very useful for modelers, but to my surprise, almost half a century later, both aircraft are on display in museums. I've left some links in the description in case you're interested. Then I learned that medical service markings for Mi-2s are also available on the market, which made this subject even more appealing. I wanted to see how the main parts fit together, so first I separated them from the sprues with a side cutter. As a side effect to applying force close to transparent details, stress cracks can appear within the material. To avoid this, I like to cut farther away from the part and melt away most of the excess plastic using a heated up scalpel blade. Then I use a precision saw to get rid of the remainder of the gate, and lastly I sand the surface flush. Speaking of force, HobbyBoss's plastic is much harder than average, so it took quite a bit of effort to clean up the rest of the parts. So here is some of the footage for you, because I know how much you just love to watch a man struggle. So after all the chopping, snipping and carving plastic away, sanding off the excess was easy. As part of the very first step, the instructions indicate to make 6 holes. 6. Well, holes are one thing, but HobbyBoss wants rectangular ones, which are way more difficult to create in such small sizes. To make matters worse, instead of a thin down membrane you could cut around with a hobby knife, you get a thick plastic board to drill and carve your way through. I mean, I'm always up for a challenge, but one thing is for sure. These guys don't call themselves HobbyBoss for no reason. In the end, it took me well over 1 hour to carve out 2 holes to temporarily secure the internal fuel tank to the cockpit floor, so I decided to just skip the other 4. Looking back, I should have simply cut off the locating tabs and used some blue tack to hold the piece in place instead. Which is exactly what I did to dry fit the door and the interior details. Then I used some masking tape to hold the fuselage halves together. Attach the dreaded nose part and the air intake. The main parts fit together quite well, and you get a decent amount of crisp detail, with some simplifications of course, but overall, not bad at all for this scale. There are a few noticeable inaccuracies though, such as the profile of the driveshaft fairing. On the real aircraft, the shape of the cross-section is like a triangle with a rounded vertex, while the kit part has a semicircular profile. This one's not an easy fix. Unlike the mold line on the bottom hiding next to some panel lines, once you know it's there, you can carefully fill it and sand it smooth. On the port side of the fuselage there are 4 sockets to attach a grab handle, and here is the part you get. Now let me explain what my problem with the kit part is in engineering terms. If you scale it up to real life size, you'll get the diameter of a salami, whereas in reality, it's much thinner, more like a sausage. Meaning, we'll need to forget about this guy. Let's eliminate guesswork by precise measurements though. As you can see, this was clearly a no-go, but the sausage looks about right. No surprise there, sausages are barely ever wrong. So, I will need to scratch build the thinner part later, but for now, I needed to get rid of the socket. First I created some plugs. There are simpler ways to do this, but I opted to use stretch sprue pieces to plug up the holes. I like to do this wherever possible because it's much easier to add panel and rivet lines on a consistent surface made entirely out of plastic than over patches of various fillers that tend to vary in hardness and other characteristics. Having drilled through the side of the fuselage, all I needed to do was insert the plugs as tightly as possible and then use some super thin cement to melt the pieces together. The tail skid that comes with the kit is also out of scale. No meat products this time, you'll just have to take my word for it. Anyway, I decided to fill its attachment points on the rear section of the tail boom. Then I put everything aside for a few hours to let the fumes completely evaporate and for the plastic to harden up again, and then snipped off the excess. I switched to a more precise side cutter and carefully removed the remaining protrusions. And then I chiseled off the rest. Certain geometries are easier to clean up with curved blades, such as this number 15 surgical blade. Then I used some 400 grit sandpaper to smooth the area further. As I was doing this, I realized that there was a hinge I also had to cut off and clean up after. I wanted to present the Mi-2 with the door open, and that required a more robust mounting point than the original one. I found some more sockets in the interior which I treated similarly to the external ones. After some more snipping and chiseling, I used black superglue to fill any remaining crevices as well as 5 large ejector pin marks. To reduce curing time, I added a few drops of kicker, also known as superglue accelerator. Don't let the container confuse you. This is CA accelerator, not super thin cement. Glass fiber pencils are ideal for the initial coarse sanding in curved or otherwise hard to reach areas. Then you can always come in with some rolled up sandpaper to further refine the surface and get rid of scratches and other types of imperfections. Dust can be easily removed by an old toothbrush. As a last step, I like to use cotton swabs to lightly polish the area, as it's easier to spot deep scratches and other blemishes on a satin or a glossy surface. I thought I was ready to get started on the interior when I suddenly realized what was fundamentally wrong with this kit. I had had an uneasy feeling since the test fitting, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what was causing it. It was at this point when I finally understood what the issue was. Let me explain. This is the port side view of the Mi-2. Note how the tail boom has a slight sag to it compared to the forward part of the fuselage. I haven't measured the aircraft, but I believe the correct length to be 11.4 meters. Now as we place the kit parts over the outline, two things become painfully obvious. Firstly, the tail boom is not angled downward as it should be, and secondly, it's significantly longer than the original. There are two sets of drawings and dimensions circulating on the internet based on various printed publications, and HobbyBoss seemed to have picked the one I believe to be wrong. Now, in order to correct this, a 6.5mm long section needs to be removed from the tail boom. What's more, a 2.5 degree downward angle will need to be introduced as the parts will be glued back together. This of course would not be possible without removing the drive shaft fairing, which due to its incorrect shape would have had to go anyway. Plus there is a joint towards the rear end of the tail section that can only be properly replicated if a short section is first removed. That's 3 major surgeries right off the bat. And there goes my plan to pick a quick and easy build for my first video. As you can imagine, I wasn't the least bit happy about my discovery. I even thought to myself, how hard would it have been for HobbyBoss to do a proper research or at least just go and look at one of the many remaining Mi-2s. As it turns out, it would have required more of an effort than I initially thought. Apparently China isn't one of the many former or current operators of the Mi-2. By the way, the Wikipedia article happens to indicate the right length and it also has a 3-view drawing with the correct geometry. And so it was time to prepare the patient for plastic surgery. As it was key to keep the fuselage halves aligned during the operation, I stuffed the inside of the parts with blue tack and secured them to each other with generous lengths of masking tape. I used masking tape also as a guide to mark where I needed to make the incision. I changed my mind about where to mark at least 5 times during this process, so please don't follow my footsteps on this one. But in the end, I could finally see the entire part that needed to come out. I mean, there are things in life that would benefit from such an increase in length, but this model kit just doesn't happen to be one of them. I added some more tape to hold the fuselage halves even tighter. My largest modeling saw was ideal to get the cut as straight as possible and also to speed up the process. This moment felt very intimidating, and I thought I had probably just ruined the entire kit, but I wanted to see this through, so I continued. I purposely left some excess plastic on the part because I wanted to have enough wiggle room to sand the joint flat. I find it useful to clean off the plastic dust after every step to get a better idea of the results. Yes, you guessed it right, I changed my mind for one last time about how much of the tail boom was to be removed and then covered the section I wanted to keep. I used the masking tape dispenser to elevate the piece off the bench and sawed off the excess. The stump was then cleaned up with the sanding pad to get a completely flat surface. Then I undressed the part and wiped off most of the remaining ink with isopropyl alcohol. And then came the moment of truth, a quick test fit to see if I was on the right path, and I thought I was. With that being said, fixing the initial geometry issue created another problem to solve. You see, at this point I had to keep the forward parts separable to be able to add the interior later. Gluing the tail boom sides together to reduce the number of parts and with that the room for alignment errors felt the most reasonable way forward. This meant having to come up with a solution to keep the tail removable while still maintaining the right angles. Now that I had at least a rough outline of a plan, I collected the blue tack residue from inside the parts with a blob of blue tack, and then I experimented a bit with some of the plastic and brass pipes I had in my stash. I wanted to use both materials. Plastic to get a strong yet flexible bond, and brass is a slightly more durable material for its straightness. I had to increase the internal diameter of the plastic one, and once it was wide enough to house the larger brass tube, I cut off the length I needed. Then I took the thinner brass tube and used it as a handle to dip the piece into superglue and place it inside the plastic cylinder. Once the glue was dry, I sanded the piece flat. I still needed something to glue it to. Luckily, HobbyBoss placed the aft cabin wall way behind where it is on the actual aircraft. This allowed me to glue it in place now and pull up a drywall of sorts in front of it later. I used thick plastic cement to attach the cylinder, and once in place, I carefully adjusted its position and added a drop of quick setting extra thin glue to secure the bond. I let it dry for a half hour before I inserted the thinner tube to see how it fit. At first, it needed a bit of convincing, so I decided to slightly round off the edge of the axle. Then I also needed to figure out a way to glue the brass axle inside the tail boom, but it was not an option as it was going to mess with the weight distribution of the helicopter, forcing it to sit on its tail. So I used a circle cutter instead and made some polystyrene discs. Then I drilled through the middle of each and gradually increased the diameter of the hole. I glued the first disc in the forward part of the fuselage to reinforce the cylinder's central position. After some fine adjustments, I needed to think of a way to check whether the axle was pointing in the right direction. For this purpose, I sandwiched a piece of straight plastic sheet in between the fuselage hulls. If it was a straight angle, the sheet was going to completely disappear behind the tube, which was exactly what it did. There was a lip left after the surgery that had to be sanded away to match the now slightly reduced tail diameter. Sanding pads are very useful for these kinds of jobs. I don't remember the exact in-between stabs, but I went from 250 to 4000 I think. The coarser grits are more for shaping, while the finer ones are better for smoothing the surface. I glued the axle into another plastic cylinder for easier mounting off camera, and then I put it through one of the styrene discs I made earlier. I needed to find the exact spot where the disc fit inside the tail, and once I found it, I glued the disc in place. At this point, I realized that the driveshaft fairing was hollow. I knew that I was going to remove it later, so I filled the cavity along the tail with a styrene rod. Once dry, I snipped off the excess and slightly trimmed the end to get a better fit. I added some spacers to keep the cylinder in a central position within the tail. Now that all the supports were in place, I could go ahead and secure the axle inside the tail boom with cement. Superglue was then also used to reinforce some of the bonds. I had a number of bad experiences with super thin cement running along strips of masking tape, so I opted for a staggered approach to join the tail boom halves. I added some tape, then added some glue elsewhere, waited for it to dry, then removed the tape and added some more glue where I previously had the tape, and so on and so forth. Once I had glue everywhere I needed it, I taped the parts together one last time and put the piece aside to dry for a few hours. Then I removed all the tape. I was happy with the joint, but I still had to find a way to restrict the tail from rotating. I came up with the simplest locking mechanism one could imagine. First, I glued 2 styrene strips inside the joint. Then I added 2 more pieces of styrene in the tailpiece to act as locating tabs. The solution worked, but the tabs proved to be too long and didn't allow for a seamless joint between the aft and the forward parts. To get rid of the gap, I shortened the tabs by sanding off the excess. Just take a look at that. Not only did the mounting and locking mechanisms work well, but also this damn thing finally started to look like an Mi-2. Comparing the model to the correct outline also confirmed my gut reaction. It wasn't perfect, but it was 1,000 times better than the original geometry of the kit. Guess what? Now it was time to butcher the tail some more. To try and protect the surface detail, I applied some tape along the sides of the driveshaft fairing. I used a 100 grit sanding pad for the most part and then carefully carved off the rest. The excess plastic was shaved off by gently scraping the tail with a blade. I peeled off the tape and continued to sand the surface with finer sanding pads. A shorter section of the fairing was removed from the forward part in a similar manner. The resulting gap was then filled with a styrene strip. After about an hour of more sanding and carving, I decided that the shape was acceptable. To restore an erased panel line, I used some flexible tape to guide the scribing tool. The tape itself would not have withstood the process, so I dabbed on some masking fluid to lock it in place. I waited for it to dry and then I ran the scriber along the tape a couple of times until I thought the line was deep enough. To fill any remaining gaps, a generous coat of superglue was applied along both seam lines of the tailpiece. Then once again, accelerator was used to speed up the curing process. Then the superglue was sanded flush with the surface. Some protruding details were erased in this process, but I didn't really care as they had ended up in wrong places as a side effect of the tail reduction surgery. I wanted to retain most of the panel lines though, so I deepened them with the scriber. I find it easier to restore panel lines on curved surfaces with a precision saw. I brushed off the plastic dust and cleaned up the lines by applying some extra thin cement. By this point I was getting so good at cutting things off the tail that I decided to remove both the tail light, which I wanted to replace by a transparent one later, as well as the tail rotor gearbox. The latter was not only oversimplified compared to the original, but it had to be removed to correct the fin's shape. HobbyBoss went with an elliptical cross-section while in reality it has more of a circular profile. Before thinning the fin, I used a black marker to highlight the sides that needed the treatment. This is a little trick to make sure that you sand exactly where you need to. Once I was happy with the overall shape, I decided to add 2 more details that had fallen prey to simplification. An access panel and one of the Mi-2's distinctive features, this joint on the tail fin. For the panel, I used an old scribing template which I held in place with some blue tack. I lightly sanded the part around the panel and went in with the scriber one more time to deepen the outline a bit. As for the joint, you will recognize the same steps used to shorten the tail. Having sawed off the tail fin, I sanded the surfaces flat and inserted pieces of sprue to fill the cavities. I did this to reinforce the parts in preparation for the next steps. I snipped off the excess and cleaned up the stumps with a sanding pad. Then I glued on some plastic discs and sanded them to shape. As you can surely tell, I couldn't quite get to a circular cross-section here because that would have meant sanding off a significant portion of the forward part of the tail as well. I poked a tiny hole in the middle and then carefully drilled out the center to allow for a thinner styrene tube to be inserted. And with that, dear friends, it's time for me to shut up and let you get on with your own build. Truth be told, addressing all these issues wasn't exactly part of the plan for my first video, but I'd like to think that it may be of some use to some of you out there. In the next episode, we'll dress up the tail boom with scratch build details. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you soon.